Get ready for the most pivotal moment in our tale, the daring infiltration into the depths of Aderon's research labs, where Ronan and Cassera risk everything to stop the perfect evolution protocol. If you've been enthralled so far, you won't want to miss what happens next. Every decision they make could change the fate of Sedora. Before we plunge into this intense showdown, remember to subscribe to this channel and stay tuned for more exciting sci-fi adventures. Your support helps us continue crafting stories that take you across galaxies and beyond. Beyond the sealed door, an automated system relentlessly scanned for intruders, forcing Ronan and Cassera to work in near silence. With each passing second, red security lights strobed against the walls, throbbing like a heartbeat. Tyrell's hands trembled as he rigged a makeshift device to jam the lab's final lock. Jenna and Rajan stood guard, braced for an onslaught of patrol drones. Cassara steadied her nerves by recalling the cave where compassion first cracked her armor, where Ronan's selfless act inspired a new path for her people. Now, on the brink of crisis, that same empathy might be their only hope. Ronan Chambers set the final nail into the edge of the newly replaced roof shingle, the sound of metal striking wood echoing across the isolated mountain clearing. Despite the crisp autumn air and the gentle sway of towering pines around him, a fine sheen of sweat dampened his brow. He paused to wipe it away, then lowered his hammer. For 10 years, Ronan had lived alone in this rugged expanse of forest, transforming what had once been a crumbling ranger outpost into a makeshift home. The wind carried the faint scent of pine needles and damp soil, a reminder of how distant civilization truly was. In the early days, he had savored the isolation, convinced he needed it to mend the broken pieces of his life. Yet now, as the sun hung low in the sky, painting the surrounding peaks in warm hues of orange and red, he found himself uncomfortably aware of a lingering ache in his chest, a persistent hollowness that refused to vanish. He shifted on the sloped roof, letting his gaze drift toward the western horizon. The sun's final light gilded the highest treetops, turning them a fiery gold against the darkening backdrop of sky. In that moment, an image flickered in his memory, an alien sunset on a far-flung planet where two suns had cast elongated, twisting shadows over crystalline plains. Ronan found his breath catching as he fought to keep the memory from overwhelming him. He shook his head, muttering an exasperated no, as though sheer force of will could bar the past from intruding. 10 years had not been enough to fully seal off that chapter of his life. Even now, stray recollections slipped through the cracks. Just then, a soft rustle in the dense pine undergrowth snapped Ronan's attention downward. Instinctively, the old ranger training kicked in, and he reached for the small tool belt at his waist, half expecting, hoping even, that it was just a deer or some local hikers with bright LED headlamps. But the glow he saw through the thickening twilight was distinctly different. A steady, bluish light flickered through the trees, too deliberate in its rhythm to be a reflection of a phone or standard camping gear. Ronan's pulse quickened. He recognized that specific shade of blue, even though he had sworn he would never see it again. With utmost caution, he set the hammer aside and edged toward the far side of the roof, peering down into the gloom. As though sensing his gaze, the light brightened, then parted the pine boughs to reveal a tall figure striding into the clearing. The figure moved with an eerie grace, and the source of the light came into focus. Sleek armor that glowed from within, casting pale ribbons of blue-white luminescence onto the surrounding tree trunks. And then Ronan saw something that made him doubt his own senses, a flash of light across skin that was unmistakably cerulean. He exhaled in a sharp rush, his heart pounding in his ears. He whispered under his breath, "This can't be real." Yet there she was, stepping fully into view, the one he had spent a decade trying to banish from his thoughts, and failing at every turn. Ronan stood rooted to the spot, torn between disbelief and an unsettling sense of recognition. Her name swam through his mind, a relic he had repeated in his dreams more times than he cared to admit. Cassara. How many nights had he startled awake, certain he could still see her silhouette or hear the echo of her alien accent? Now, the very figure who had occupied his memories and caused his exile was standing in his yard as though she had stepped out of the past. The luminous armor, intricate in its design, gleamed more elaborately than the practical combat suit he remembered, and it confirmed one chilling truth. If Kasara was here, it wasn't simply a casual visit. He glanced around for an escape or a hiding place, but found his feet glued to the old wooden shingles. Logic shouted at him. He should be angry, or at least wary. But a different part of his mind, the one that remembered how she had risked her life for him once, insisted that perhaps she was here for a reason. Finally, he forced himself to climb down the ladder. Each rung brought him closer to the ground, and to her. By the time he stepped onto the grass, his heart felt ready to burst, a strange mixture of trepidation and an indefinable longing. Kasara's gaze locked onto his the moment his boots touched the ground. Her eyes were more vivid than he recalled, an impossible shade of gold offset by the cerulean hue of her skin. She lifted one hand in a silent greeting, her voice a mellow vibration in the twilight air. "You remain elusive, Ronan Chambers," she said, her intonation crisp yet musical. "It took considerable effort to find you, even in such a secluded location." Ronan managed a shaky laugh. "That was kind of the point. I wasn't looking to be found." For a moment, she studied his face in silence, as though absorbing every minute change the last decade had etched there. "Human denial is common, is it not?" she asked. "Yet I am indeed here, and very much real." He tried to focus on her words, but part of him was lost in how, even a decade ago, her directness had caught him off guard. "I can't exactly doubt my own eyes," he said quietly. Then he gestured lamely at the cabin. "You, want to come inside? It might get cold." She didn't move, but her gaze flickered to the worn planks of his porch. "I remain comfortable at this temperature," she replied. "Yet I recognize the courtesy of your offer. A human custom, correct?" "It is." Ronan swallowed, recalling the number of times he had explained trivial human etiquette to her. Odd how that memory made his chest tighten with warmth instead of dread. "Besides," he added, "I suspect we need to talk." He moved to the door, shooting a glance over his shoulder. She followed, her stride elegant and purposeful, the subtle whir of servos in her armor accompanying each step. As they reached the doorway, he couldn't escape the thought that the last time they had stood side by side, it had been in the remains of a collapsed mining tunnel on her world, a place he had sworn he would never return to. Inside, the cabin's main room appeared cramped and plain compared to any advanced facility Kasara would be accustomed to. A small brick fireplace occupied one corner, its embers glowing faintly from when Ronan had heated his early supper. Several handmade shelves lined the walls, stacked with dog-eared books and the occasional survival guide. The only decorations were tokens of his past, a battered canteen, a scorched length of rope from one of his near-death missions as a ranger, and a single framed photograph by the fireplace. Kasara's gaze, ever analytical, took in every detail at a glance. She moved with the meticulous caution of someone who expected traps or hidden threats, though Ronan sensed no hostility in her posture. Instead, she approached the photograph, her expression flickering with an intensity he couldn't quite read. The photo showed Ronan in his old expedition gear, standing in front of a research vessel on the planet Sedora. He had cropped out the team, leaving only the spires of crystalline rock in the background, spires that looked hauntingly like the ones that had nearly buried them both alive. Kasara's voice was soft, almost reverent. "You kept this, even when your superiors blamed everything on your decision to help me." Ronan crossed the room, trying not to focus on how close she was. "I thought about tossing it out a few times," he admitted, "but maybe I wasn't ready to forget." She nodded, placing the frame back with a delicate touch. "We seldom accept forgetting. Even my people, who prize logic, learn from the impressions left behind." Then her tone shifted, becoming more formal. "I came here to ask for your help, Ronan Chambers." He wanted to laugh, but it caught in his throat. "After all these years, you just show up asking for help? You vanished as soon as your injuries were treated, took off in your ship without a word. I lost my career for disobeying orders to save your life, but you probably know that." Her eyes flickered, and for a moment, he thought he saw genuine remorse. "We are taught to take survival as a purely tactical matter. My superiors believed your compassion endangered their mission. They had me under observation. My presence on Earth, my communication with you, it was deemed a threat to national security on Sedora. My departure was not exactly voluntary." Ronan felt the air leave his lungs. "So they forced you to cut ties." "In a manner of speaking." She lifted a hand to her sternum, where he remembered bandaging her wound amid the collapsed crystal caverns. I realized in those caves that there was more to existence than strict protocol. Your actions defied every order you'd been given, yet they felt right. That contradiction disturbed my people. So they recalled me at once, claiming I was compromised. For 10 years, I've tried to understand what it was I felt back then and why I could never truly forget. Despite the unresolved hurt simmering inside him, Ronan sensed the stark sincerity in her word. He gestured toward the worn sofa near the fireplace. Okay, start talking. If you're here risking everything, it must be important. Kasara sat with uncharacteristic hesitance. The soft cushions sank beneath her, and she placed both hands on her armored knees, posture rigid. Ronan took a chair across from her, deliberately leaving space between them. He was aware of her gaze lingering on him, scanning him perhaps for changes in appearance or for some intangible shift in spirit. She inhaled deeply, her lips thinning with tension before she spoke. My world, Sidora, stands at a crossroads, she said, voice controlled, though tremors wove through it. Our scientists have developed what they call the perfect evolution protocol. In the aftermath of my encounter with you, certain officials became concerned about the effects of emotional contamination. They'd seen how you influenced me, how I began to exhibit traits considered unnatural for a dedicated warrior. I was not the only one. Other Sidorans started to question the extent to which we suppress emotions for the sake of efficiency. Ronan listened, arms crossed. So they're worried your entire population might start feeling too much because of mercy. He felt a pang of guilt as he said it, but also a sliver of pride. Maybe compassion had made a difference after all. Kasara nodded. They decided it was too great a risk. The perfect evolution protocol is essentially a wide-scale plan to eliminate what they view as archaic emotional responses. I've seen the prototypes of the technology, advanced neural devices meant to quell emotional impulses at their root. If they succeed, Sidora will no longer have the capacity for empathy, for deeper connections, for love. She stumbled over that last word as though it was unfamiliar on her tongue. Ronan's gut twisted. He recalled those crystalline caves where, despite her lethal skill as a soldier, she had bled beside him, trembling from pain and vulnerability. He had been the one to hold her through the worst of it. In that bleak, life-threatening setting, something had sparked between them, something raw and undeniably real. You're saying they want to wipe out the possibility of what you felt for me, for everyone? Exactly. Kasara's eyes hardened. I've spent the last decade researching, uncovering truths hidden within our traditions. Feelings were not always suppressed so severely on Sidora. Thousands of years ago, we embraced them as part of our nature. Now, if this protocol is unleashed planet-wide, it'll be as if a piece of our collective soul is ripped away. He pressed his lips together, absorbing the weight of her words. And you think I can help you stop this? She hesitated, then leaned forward. You're the only human to ever break through that barrier in a Sidoran warrior. Through me. They studied every aspect of our interaction, but they still don't fully understand how emotion can be harnessed as strength. You do. You live it. Her voice trembled again, and she drew a breath. Please, Ronan, come back to Sidora. Help me save my people from themselves. His first instinct was to recoil. Returning to that planet could mean re-triggering all the painful memories he'd tried to bury. The cost might be more than he could handle. Yet looking at her now, seeing how each word carried the desperation of someone fighting for her home, he found the refusal lodged in his throat. I don't even know if I can be of any real use. Kasara's armored fingers flexed on her knees, leaving faint indents. You underestimate yourself, she said, her voice quiet yet firm. I've studied Earth's responses to adversity. You demonstrate empathy in ways we once dismissed as chaotic. Yet it was precisely that chaos that saved my life in the caves. If it hadn't been for your refusal to follow orders, your illogical compassion, I would have died there. She paused, looking down at her hands, as though the confession weighed on her. I need that perspective now. If there's a chance to sway some of our leaders, to show them that emotion isn't a flaw, you can help me prove it. Ronan lowered his head, memories flooding back unbidden. He could still see the swirl of dust and crystal shards, the glow of Kasara's life force waning under emergency lighting. He had risked everything to keep her alive, ignoring the official directive that she was a liability, an enemy from an unallied race. Maybe that was the day he had truly lost his future in the Earth Expeditionary Force. But in saving her, he'd found a cause he believed in. "I couldn't let you die," he said softly, responding more to the memory than to her appeal. She glanced up, her eyes luminous in the dim cabin. "I know, and that's why I've come." He blew out a breath, wrestling with conflicting emotions. "You realize if I do this, there's no guarantee Earth's authorities will just look the other way. Last time, I was nearly court-martialed and ostracized. This time, I could be labeled a traitor." "Are you truly content here?" she asked gently. "Shutting out every memory of your experiences, living in isolation for a life that might be safe but unfulfilled? I know a part of you yearns for something more." Her question struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He had tried to make this quiet existence enough, hunting, building, reading, coaxing the land into some semblance of a home. Yet in quiet moments, he'd find his mind drifting back across the stars to a place far from Earth, where he had tasted something akin to destiny. "I wouldn't call this a fulfilling life," he admitted at length, "but it's been peaceful, at least." Kasara rose from the sofa, crossing the small gap between them. The glow of her armor illuminated her face. "I cannot promise peace. The fight on Sidora will be dangerous, and your presence will be controversial. But I can promise that it matters." He let out a shaky laugh. "I never did go for the easy path, did I?" A tentative smile curved her lips, an expression that looked almost foreign, as if her features weren't entirely used to the gesture. "No," she said, "nor did I once you showed me another way. My people mock it as a foolish, emotional path, but I see it as courage. That's what I need. That's what we need." The flickering firelight danced across the two of them, forging a tableau of longing and unspoken resolve. Finally, Ronan placed a hand over Kessera's, feeling the cool metal of her gauntlet beneath his fingertips. "All right," he said, the words more difficult than he'd expected. "Let's do this. Let's stop them from erasing who you are, who your people could be." Relief washed across Kasara's features, so tangible that Ronan almost felt it too. She pressed a subtle switch along her left forearm, and her visor retracted, letting him see her face fully for the first time in a decade. The outlines were as sharp and proud as he remembered. High cheekbones, a delicate ridge above each brow, and a stern set to her jaw that once announced her unyielding discipline. But there was also something new, a softness in her eyes that suggested the seeds of an emotion her people claimed to have purged centuries ago. "This is more advanced than the armor you wore before," Ronan observed, trying to ground himself in a practical detail. The swirling insignia along her arms glowed with subdued pulses of energy, and the plates of her suit seemed to shift with the slightest movement, as if anticipating her next motion. She inclined her head. "Our technology has evolved swiftly over the past 10 years, partly in pursuit of the perfect evolution protocol. We have improvements in quantum field manipulation and personal shielding. Most of these innovations were spurred by the fear of infiltration, by any form of emotional contagion that outsiders like you might represent. Ironically, they gave me the means to reach you undetected." He gave a wry smile. "I guess it's one way to use their own progress against them." Then clearing his throat, he said, "You might as well get comfortable. I'll make coffee, assuming your system can still handle our caffeine." Kasara tilted her head. "I recall the first time I tried it in the caves. You used a portable heater to boil water in that battered metal container. My reaction was energetic." Ronan chuckled. "That's one way to put it. You wouldn't stop talking about Earth's gravitational fields and our architectural styles for 6 straight hours." She arched a brow, a ghost of amusement in her eyes. "I suppose I was excited to experience a new biochemical stimulus. Your simple beverage is quite the revelation for someone accustomed to sterile rations." He moved to the small kitchenette, rummaging for the bar of coffee grounds he kept sealed in a tin. As he busied himself with the pot, he felt Kisara's watchful gaze. There was something intensely personal about having her here, in this private refuge he had built. Part of him wanted to dwell on how strange it felt, this mixture of comfort and tension. Part of him wanted to demand why she'd stayed away so long, leaving him to shoulder the blame for her rescue mission. But that, he realized, could wait. They had more urgent concerns, and if he was honest, some part of him was just glad she was here at all. Finally, the water began to boil, and he poured it over the grounds, the fragrant aroma filling the cabin. Kasara approached quietly, her footsteps noiseless on the wooden floor. "Thank you," she said, her voice nearly drowned by the crackle of the fireplace. It wasn't clear whether she was thanking him for the coffee or for agreeing to return with her to the planet that had once nearly claimed both their lives. They sipped their coffee in silence for a moment, the tension between them as palpable as the warmth of the mug in Ronan's hands. He could sense 1,000 questions brimming in the space between them, both about the mission at hand and the unspoken feelings they had never truly resolved. At last, Kasara set her mug down on the rough-hewn table, straightening her posture as though summoning her courage. "I should tell you more," she began, her voice low, "about what's waiting for us on Sedora. The perfect evolution protocol is nearly operational. Lady Talix, the high official presiding over all research, has convened her top scientists to finalize the device that will be used to eradicate unnecessary emotions. The timeline is short. Within a matter of weeks, the device could be tested on a large population center." Ronan frowned. "Tested? So they haven't implemented it yet?" "Not fully," Kasara replied. "They've done small-scale experiments on subjects deemed expendable. Prisoners, outcasts, those who were suspected of showing empathy. Many died. Those who survived changed. Cold, unresponsive, unable to connect with others. They are shells of who they once were. I've seen them, Ronan, and it's beyond horrific. There's no outcry because outwardly they function, but the spark that once animated them is just gone." He ran a hand over his unshaven jaw, shaking his head in disbelief. "And this Lady Talix, she justifies it as progress?" Kasara's jaw tightened. "She argues that emotions lead to poor decision-making, to conflict, and that by removing them, we become the ultimate rational beings. She cites historical records indicating that our ancestors nearly destroyed themselves through bouts of destructive passion. It's a well-spun narrative, but it omits the countless instances where compassion and love saved us. The official line is that emotions are a liability. Once the protocol is live, they believe we'll be unstoppable." "But also inhuman," Ronan murmured, though inhuman seemed the wrong word for an alien race. Maybe unfeeling was more accurate, but the thought of that future chilled him. He set his coffee aside. "So we land on Sidora, then what? We can't just march up to Talix and demand she stop." "No," Kasara agreed, "but there are pockets of dissent. Some, like myself, see the old ways as incomplete. We might gather enough allies to sabotage the device. We still have a chance to shut it down before it goes global." Ronan nodded slowly, a gnawing apprehension settling in. "It's definitely not going to be a walk in the park, and I'm guessing the moment you show up with me, they'll have a reason to intensify security." Her chin lifted, eyes resolute. "That's why I traveled alone. I needed to move beneath their notice, which wasn't easy. Once we arrive, secrecy will be nearly impossible, so we must move quickly and decisively." The fire popped in the hearth, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Ronan cast one final look around the cabin that had been his refuge and his prison for the past decade. He felt a pang of regret, wondering if he'd ever return. Then he squared his shoulders and looked Kasara in the eye. "All right, I'll pack a few essentials and we can head for your ship. Let's go save your world. And maybe mine too in the process." A faint smile flickered over Kasara's lips. Ronan Chambers, still defying logic at every turn. "Very well, let us go and face the unknown together." And in that moment, a glimmer of hope seemed to light the cabin brighter than any fire ever could. Ronan stepped out into the crisp night air, an overnight bag slung over his shoulder. The pine-laden breeze stirred across the clearing, carrying the soft hush of rustling needles. It was a quiet that he had learned to treasure, even if it had become a self-imposed exile. Kasara walked beside him, each measured footstep emitting a muted mechanical whir from the joints of her high-tech armor. Though she moved gracefully, she still looked slightly out of place in the rustic environment, a living fragment of an advanced world dropped into an old earth forest. They passed the edge of his rough-hewn porch, where a rickety step creaked in protest under the combined weight of man and alien warrior. The moonlight glinted off the polished curves of Kessera's armored arms, casting faint ribbons of luminescence over the ground. Just beyond the tree line lay a narrow path that angled downward. That path, once used for ranger patrols, led to a natural clearing wide enough to accommodate a shuttle, one that Ronan had never expected to see again. His heart thudded heavily against his ribs, not entirely from exertion. 100 questions churned in his mind. Would this mission really stand a chance? Could one human possibly persuade a highly disciplined alien culture to abandon a technology they regarded as their next evolutionary step? And what if he failed? In the next breath, he wondered about smaller, more personal matters. Why the sight of Kasara's face still made his chest tighten, or how she could return after all these years and reignite feelings he thought he had buried. He gave his surroundings one last glance. The cabin's dark silhouette lingered against the starlit sky, the roof he had so painstakingly repaired, looking oddly vulnerable now that he was about to leave it behind. That structure had become his sanctuary, but also a monument to everything he'd lost: his career, his sense of belonging, and the intangible thread that connected him to the broader universe. Perhaps it was time to stop hiding. Kasara paused halfway down the path and shifted her gaze to him. "We're close," she said quietly, though the soft hum from below confirmed as much. He could see a subtle glow through the dense pines. Her landing craft was tucked just out of sight. When they finally emerged into the clearing, Ronan felt a jolt of mingled awe and apprehension. The vessel was sleeker than anything he had encountered during his days in the Earth Expeditionary Force, its hull an elegant curve of dark metal crisscrossed with glowing lines. The azure illumination matched the pattern on Kasara's armor, as though both pilot and craft shared a single heartbeat. A ramp extended invitingly from the underbelly, and he caught himself hesitating. Memories flooded back, stepping onto alien ships, brimming with curiosity about the unknown. That adventurous spirit had once defined him. "It's beautiful," he managed, breaking the momentary silence. "A lot quieter than the old dropships I remember." Kasara nodded. "Our designs have evolved, particularly for clandestine operations. You'll find internal modifications to dampen noise and mask heat signatures." She glanced around the clearing. "I apologize for intruding on your solitude in such a dramatic way." Ronan exhaled and forced a half-smile. "Well, if we're going to crash my peaceful retirement, might as well do it in style." With a final resolute glance at the forest around them, he straightened his shoulders. "Let's go, then." He followed her up the ramp, heart pounding. The moment he stepped inside, the hatch sealed behind them with a soft hiss, as though severing his ties to Earth in a single breath. Over the years, he had thought about making a grand exit from his secluded life, maybe returning to a city job or catching a shuttle to the nearest orbital station. But this was far more drastic. He was, in essence, leaving his planet behind and possibly risking his life among a race that had once branded him a threat. Yet Kasara's presence lent him a strange confidence, buoyed by the memory of that desperate moment in the caves when he had refused to abandon her. Back then, his gut told him he was doing the right thing. Now, with the stakes multiplied, he could only hope his instincts wouldn't betray him. The vessel's interior was a study in subtlety, steeped in soft blue lighting that pulsed in tandem with distant, humming machinery. Ronan found himself in a compact corridor that curved gently, the walls and ceiling forming a seamless arch. The material felt both organic and metallic, as if grown rather than forged. Ahead, the path split into two directions, with unobtrusive indicators on the walls, a language of alien symbols that Ronan suspected Kasara read fluently. "There are quarters for you on the port side," she said, gesturing down the left corridor. "I've made certain the environmental settings will be comfortable enough for a human passenger." "Appreciate it," he replied. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, like they were both acutely aware of how alien this environment one would soon become. He caught Kasara's gaze flicking to him, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something else. To break the silence, he asked, "How long's the journey?" "Just under 70 hours by your measure," she answered. "I've calculated a route that minimizes detection. We'll be skirting several systems occupied by my people's outposts." Then her eyes flickered with something like caution. "We can discuss the plan in detail once you're settled. The modifications I made to the vessel will protect us from casual scans, but any undue attention from my government could be a problem." They reached a small open area that resembled a central hub, an oval chamber with a large transparent map display floating in midair. Countless star systems dotted the projection, arcs showing potential flight paths. Ronan recognized the faint lines depicting the route to Sidora's sector. It looked straightforward on a hologram, but he knew better. Crossing interstellar boundaries without clearance was rarely simple. Kasara led him into an adjacent control room, an efficient space with a single pilot seat and a series of curved consoles. Ronan noted the seat's design was elongated to fit Kasara's physique, reminding him of how different her species truly was from humans. Yet, as she took her place at the helm, the straightforward confidence in her posture was unmistakably familiar. He recalled how she had once navigated collapsing tunnels with that same level of composure. Bringing up a series of readouts, Kasara typed in quick commands, and the ship trembled ever so slightly. Screens flickered to life with atmospheric conditions, engine power, and gravitational readings. Her expression hardened, the lines of her face reflecting the seriousness of their task. "We'll slip out of Earth's orbit in stealth mode. Once we're clear, I'll activate faster-than-light capabilities for the main leg of the trip." "Understood," Ronan said, stepping closer to examine the floating readouts. He recognized a few universal symbols: velocity, hull integrity, but much of the data was indecipherable script. "You're the pilot here. I'll just try not to push any wrong buttons." She managed a slight smile. "I trust your instincts more than you realize. Even so, the controls are keyed to my biometric signature. Should we find ourselves in an emergency, I'll grant you limited access." He nodded, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. Beyond the cool professionalism, there was that lingering sense of unfinished business between them, an unspoken question of what, if anything, they would be to each other once this mission concluded. And yet, the ship thrummed beneath his feet, demanding their full attention. "Let's get this show on the road, then," Ronan murmured, bracing himself against a nearby bulkhead. As if in answer, Kasara initiated the engines. A soft hum intensified, and a subtle gravitational shift pressed them downward, signaling liftoff. The ship rose smoothly, and through a small external display near the helm, Ronan glimpsed the tree line dropping away in a swirl of midnight and moonlight. His heart clenched for a moment, a visceral goodbye to the only home he'd known for 10 solitary years. But as the craft angled upward, the horizon curved, and Earth's distant lights flickered below like a shimmering tapestry. Part of him felt that same old pang of wonder he'd felt it as a rookie, gazing at planets from orbit for the first time. The rest of him was on high alert, fully aware that this was no leisurely voyage. Once they cleared Earth's atmosphere, Kasara navigated them into stealth mode. The engine's hum dropped to a nearly imperceptible vibration, and the overhead lights dimmed, shifting to an even subtler blue. Everything became a hush of mechanics and power, a testament to her people's engineering. The monitor showed few blinking signals, a smattering of satellites, some commercial freighters in the distance, and the glimmer of Earth's nearest orbital station, but no signs of immediate pursuit. "We should be beyond Earth's standard detection range within 20 minutes, Kasara announced, fingers moving fluidly over the control panels. "Then I'll plot our course for a faster-than-light transition. Once we jump, we won't be able to maintain real-time communication with Earth, even if you wanted to." Ronan exhaled. "Not that I really have anyone to call," he muttered wryly. He tugged his gaze away from the readouts to focus on her. "So, about this plan to stop the perfect evolution protocol. You mentioned we have allies on your planet?" She inclined her head. "Not official allies, at least not by government sanction. More like sympathetic factions. The biggest advantage we have is that dissent runs deeper than Lady Talix admits. Although most Sidorans have been conditioned to revere logic, they aren't wholly free of emotional undercurrents. All it takes is a catalyst." "A catalyst," Ronan echoed. "Like me?" Kasara's eyes flicked to his, and there was a brief flicker of uncertainty, almost vulnerability. "Not just you, us. The story of what happened in those crystalline tunnels has circulated in secret. Whispers about how a human chose compassion over protocol and how a Sidoran warrior began to question everything. My presence alone stokes rumors, but with you by my side, we might transform those rumors into actual resistance. He nodded. But it won't be simple. We'll likely face the very people who orchestrated your recall a decade ago. Indeed, and they won't hesitate to detain or eliminate perceived threats. She paused, scanning him from head to toe. You realize if we fail, you may not be able to return to your simple life, or any life at all. Ronan forced a tight laugh. A simple life. Maybe that's all I wanted when I lost my old career. But I've learned there's a difference between simple and isolated. And I'm tired of being alone, Kasara, physically and otherwise. If taking this risk is what it takes to stop your people from erasing their capacity to feel, I'm in. She studied him, and in her unwavering gaze, he saw a hint of the same spark she had shown before. Your logic is flawed, she said softly, her lips curving into a faint smile. And yet, it gives me courage. The moment lingered, charged with memories they had only half confronted. Their bond, born in crisis and nurtured by empathy, felt simultaneously fragile and unbreakable. Ronan coughed, trying to steady his heartbeat. So, next steps? Are we bunking down for this trip or planning the entire infiltration right away? A slight nod from Kessera. Both. I'll handle the initial jump sequence. Then we can meet in the main cabin to strategize. Try to get comfortable in your quarters if you need rest. It's going to be a long 70 hours. Ronan cast one last glance at the diminishing view of Earth, committing the sight to memory. Then he inhaled, turning toward the corridor. All right, let's plan how to keep an entire civilization from losing its soul. Kasara's ship was smaller than most long-haul crafts, yet it held an impressive array of amenities, proof of her people's meticulous design philosophy. Ronan discovered this firsthand after he left the cockpit area and made his way to the passenger quarters. The door slid aside with a whisper, revealing a compact but functional living space. The ceiling curved overhead, reminiscent of the vessel's exterior architecture, and the walls emitted a subdued glow instead of harsh overhead lights. He sat down on the contoured bunk, which automatically adjusted, softening beneath his weight. There was a built-in console along the wall that displayed environmental settings, temperature, humidity, even a dial for a mild atmospheric scent that could mimic pine forests or ocean breezes. The presence of these comforts struck him as odd, given that Kasara's people prided themselves on austerity and logic. But maybe it was a reflection of how some attitudes on Sidora had changed, even if only in small pockets. Ronan reached into his bag and pulled out the single-framed photo he had decided to bring. It wasn't the same one from the cabin. He'd left that on the mantel. Instead, all you said, he had a smaller snapshot, a candid image taken by an old colleague, showing Ronan back when he was younger and burning with ambition. In the picture, he was smiling, genuinely excited about the next big discovery. He set it on a narrow shelf, a reminder of the man he used to be, and perhaps a guide for who he might become again. A soft beep alerted him to someone at the door. It slid open to reveal Kasara, now without her helmet or gauntlets, wearing a form-fitting underlayer of the armor. He noticed the fine lines of her collarbone, the subtle structure of her shoulders that marked her as humanoid but undeniably alien, her cerulean skin bearing faint patterns, almost like etchings that only became visible in certain light. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. He nodded, motioning for her to enter. "Sure, I was just settling in." She stepped inside, standing near the console where she glanced at the environmental settings. "I realize this environment may feel cold by human standards," she commented. "Let me know if you need any adjustments." "I'm fine," he assured her. "Compared to those caves we survived, this feels like a resort." An amused glimmer touched her expression. "Yes, those caves. I still dream about them sometimes." Ronan stiffened slightly at the reminder, recalling those claustrophobic passages, the spires of crystal that nearly crushed them. "Me too," he admitted, "more than I care to." She took a step closer, her posture uncertain, as though she was testing the boundaries of closeness. "I wanted to check on you, see if you needed anything before we jump." Her gaze flicked to the photograph. "Is that you, back on Earth?" He offered a small nod. Yeah, from my early expedition days. Before everything. Silence hung for a moment, thick with unspoken things. He found himself oddly hesitant, uncertain how to navigate this unfamiliar closeness. They had been physically close once, in a life-or-death context, but this was different. No immediate danger, just two people grappling with an unspoken bond. Finally, Cassara reached out, brushing her fingertips against his wrist. Her touch felt cool, even through the thin underlayer. "Ronan," she began, voice low, "thank you. You had every reason to refuse, yet here you are." He met her gaze and swallowed hard. "Truthfully, I couldn't let you face this alone. Not if there's a chance to stop what's coming. And maybe to figure out what we couldn't figure out back then." She bowed her head, closing her eyes briefly. "We have time now, at least a little. We'll strategize, yes, but also talk." Ronan nodded, the weight in his chest easing just slightly. "Yeah, talking sounds good." The transition to faster-than-light travel was smoother than Ronan expected. One moment, the stars outside the secondary monitor were still, distant pinpricks against infinite darkness. And the next, they stretched into elongated lines, then vanished into a swirling haze of what he could only describe as cosmic distortion. In the cockpit, Cassara tapped a final series of commands, and an almost imperceptible shudder ran through the ship. "Faster than light engaged," she announced, rising from the pilot's chair. "Barring any complications, we should arrive in Sidora's sector in approximately 68 hours." Ronan stood behind her, his hands braced on the back of the co-pilot seat. "And from there, we make our final approach under stealth, right?" She inclined her head. "Yes, there's a navigational path near the system's outer edge where sensor sweeps are irregular. Once inside Sidora's atmosphere, we'll have to rely on infiltration tactics." "Which is code for brace for trouble," Ronan quipped, though there was little humor in his voice. Cassara offered a nod that might have been agreement. "Precisely. Our best chance is to land outside the main city, then connect with an underground network of dissenters. Some of my former companions who suspect that pure logic isn't the only path. They call themselves the Ardent Circle." "The Ardent Circle?" He tilted his head, intrigued. "A name that suggests passion." Her lips curved slightly. "Indeed, they exist in the shadows, though they risk execution or forced reconditioning if discovered." She paused, as though weighing her words carefully. "Several of them served with me when I was still loyal to Talix's regime. They witnessed changes in my behavior after meeting you, and some started questioning the system as a result. Others had pre-existing doubts. Over time, the group has quietly expanded." Ronan let out a slow breath. "So the seeds of rebellion are there. We just need to water them, so to speak." Cassara's gaze traveled to one of the monitors, where lines of alien script scrolled past, a status report on the ship's systems. "Yes, but you must be cautious. The slightest misstep will alert Talix's forces. Even the slightest rumor that I've returned with a human companion could trigger a crackdown." His expression darkened. "And the perfect evolution protocol. How far along is it?" "Too far," she replied grimly. "They are in the final stages. Once they complete the central suppression hub, they can broadcast the neural wave across major population centers. Drones will deliver localized devices to outlying settlements. Sounds like we have to strike fast." "Exactly," she said, meeting his gaze. "We'll need to plan the infiltration of their main research facility. That's where the central device is being perfected. Sabotaging it, or at least delaying its deployment, might buy us time. If we're lucky, we can destroy it outright, or gather enough evidence to turn public opinion against Talix." He mulled it over. "If your society is as logic-driven as you say, will evidence alone be enough to sway them?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. "It might, if we can show the potential side effects, like the irreversible damage to the mind, the risk of rendering our people emotionless automatons. Already rumors of the device's failures have trickled out. We just need proof." Her mention of proof tugged at Ronan's memory of the caves, of the day he'd realized that beneath Cassara's unyielding stoicism lay a person capable of true feeling. He tried to imagine a world where that possibility was forcibly removed from every individual. The thought was terrifying. "All right," he said at last. "We'll gather intel, Find the device, sabotage it, and rally your people against Talix's plan. Easy enough, right? Kasara's mouth tightened in a grim approximation of a smile. Sarcasm aside, that is the essence. They fell silent for a moment, the subtle pulse of faster-than-light travel thrumming around them, as if enveloping them in a cocoon of possibilities. Later, they reconvened in a small common area situated behind the cockpit. The room contained a circular table that was flush with the floor until Kasara tapped a sensor, prompting it to rise gracefully. The walls displayed tinted panels of data streams, providing continuous readouts of the ship's status. Despite the technologically advanced setting, Ronan recognized an effort to mimic certain communal aspects, like how humans might gather around a table to discuss strategy or simply share a meal. Kasara offered him a sealed pouch of nutrient rations. I apologize for the lack of Earth-based cuisine. My personal stores are limited. Ronan tore open the pouch and sniffed. The aroma was vaguely nutty, but otherwise indescribable. He took a cautious bite, finding it bland yet edible. I've had worse during Ranger survival training, he commented. At least these don't taste like chalk. A hint of amusement touched her expression. I'm relieved they are adequate. Sidorans typically do not place much emphasis on flavor variety. Efficiency is prioritized over culinary enjoyment. He swallowed another mouthful, reflecting on how that one detail said so much about her culture. Back when I first met you, you hardly even acknowledged the concept of taste. Has that changed for you? Kasara tilted her head, considering the question. My physiology hasn't changed drastically, though my appreciation for subtlety has. After crossing paths with you, I allowed myself to explore experiences beyond pure survival. Flavor was one of them. She placed a pouch in front of her, but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she studied Ronan's face. You're the first human I've ever truly spoken with. Others on Sidora have met humans, but only in formal delegations where everything was scripted. He set his half-eaten ration aside. I guess we had no script in those caves. Precisely, she murmured. Her tone held a depth of meaning, like she was recalling every whispered conversation, every shared moment that had slipped past protocol. That raw connection was enough to unravel years of conditioning. I had never laughed, never experienced sympathy for an outsider. Yet in that dire situation, you made me laugh, and you risked your life to save mine. Ronan reached out, letting his palm rest lightly on the back of her hand. The armor had retracted partially, leaving her fingers free. Her skin felt cool, an echo of the day he had first noticed her unusual hue. I guess we were both a little foolish, he said softly. Our superiors weren't thrilled. She offered a grim nod. They saw it as a threat, Talix in particular. After I returned, she realized I was no longer the same dedicated warrior. She quarantined me for debriefing, which turned into a months-long observation. I had to feign compliance, pretend I was returning to normal. Eventually, they allowed me to resume duties, but they never fully trusted me again. And you never contacted me. Kasara's eyes flickered with regret. They monitored every channel I had access to. Any communication would have drawn scrutiny. I left at the first real opportunity I found. Even that took years to arrange. He nodded slowly, pulling his hand back. It stung a little, recalling how abandoned he had felt. But it also answered a question that had haunted him since she vanished. Did she simply not care, or was she forced away? Now he had confirmation. It was never really a choice. The hours stretched into the ship's version of night, a programmed cycle that dimmed the quarter lights. Kasara and Ronan each retreated to their quarters for some rest, though an undercurrent of tension and anticipation made actual sleep elusive. Ronan found himself lying awake, staring at the softly illuminated ceiling. The gentle hum of faster-than-light travel thrummed in the background. Lulling yet eerie, he replayed the day's revelations, his departure from the cabin, Kasara's reappearance, the looming threat on Sidora. Beneath that tangle of worries, another realization churned. He and Kasara were on the same ship, with time, actual, uninterrupted time, to confront the feelings that had taken root so unexpectedly all those years ago. He wondered if they would emerge from this mission as allies, friends, or something more. His mind drifted to that final moment in the caves, right after he had bandaged her wound. She had drifted off into a restless, feverish sleep, and he had pressed a tentative kiss to her forehead, a gesture she had barely understood, yet one that might have altered the course of both their lives. Eventually, he rose from the bed, deciding that sleep was impossible for now. He left his quarters, feet padding softly over the metallic deck. The corridor lights glowed in subdued blue tones, guiding him to the central hub. Perhaps planning or reviewing data would occupy his mind better than staring at the ceiling. He was halfway there when he heard a series of soft chimes, system notifications. Rounding the corner, he found Kasara at the controls of the main console. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes reflecting the gentle luminescence of the screens. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, the corner of her mouth curving in understanding. He joined her, noticing the display was showing Kadora's planetary orbit and sensor sweeps from an outlying defense station. "Looks like neither of us is getting much rest," he said. "Everything all right?" She tapped a command, zooming in on a rotating model of Sidora's system. The autopilot flagged a potential complication. "One of our scout frigates has changed patrol routes recently. This means they've stepped up surveillance. We might need to alter our approach vector." "Can we handle that?" "Likely," she answered, "but it will add another few hours to our journey. We'll still be hidden for the moment, but it's a reminder that Talix's regime is highly vigilant. They may be anticipating any external interference." He exhaled, scanning the data. "Then we adapt. We always did in the caves, right?" Her gaze flicked to him. "Indeed. You once told me humans are good at rolling with the punches." A wry smile pulled at his mouth. "Yeah, that's one way of putting it." They lapsed into a thoughtful silence, each absorbed in the swirling holographic data. The low hum of the ship seemed to grow louder, enveloping them in a kind of intimate stillness. Ronan could feel the warmth of Kasara's presence beside him, and a memory spiked through his mind. The moment he realized she was more than a stoic soldier, that behind her serious eyes was a person capable of genuine connection. Impulsively, he turned to face her. "Kasara, when all this is over, assuming we somehow succeed, what happens then?" She blinked as if startled by the sudden pivot. "I haven't allowed myself to think that far," she admitted. "So much depends on whether my people can accept a different path. If the protocol is destroyed, we might see a shift in our culture, or we might face a civil conflict." "I don't know." He nodded, absorbing her words. "So we'll figure it out together. For now, let's focus on making sure we get the chance to have that conversation." Kasara's shoulders relaxed, and for a fleeting moment, she placed her hand atop his on the console, her skin cool but the gesture filled with warmth. "Thank you, Ronan," she murmured, "for standing beside me in this." He answered with a brief squeeze of her fingers. "Always." During the final leg of their journey, Ronan and Kasara braced themselves for the delicate dance that lay ahead. The days of faster-than-light travel gave way to the tense approach through Sidora's outer system. Kasara navigated them along a route that skirted the planet's recognized shipping lanes, winding past distant moons and asteroid fields kept deliberately uncharted by Sidoran officials. Despite the ship's stealth capabilities, every sensor ping brought a fresh jolt of unease, an urgent reminder that at any moment, an alert might sound in some distant control tower, and a squadron of interceptors would descend upon them. Ronan spent these hours poring over topographical data of Sidora's main continent, courtesy of Kasara's archives. The planet was dominated by broad plains of tinted crystal formations that looked like spiny forests rising from the ground, interspersed with sprawling cities built in geometric precision. The capital, Idiron, lay at the planet's heart, an urban labyrinth of tiered spires encircled by a central research district. That was where Lady Talix's facility waited, buried beneath layers of security systems and guarded by a specialized force loyal to the perfect evolution protocol. "As soon as we breach the atmosphere, we'll engage cloaking at lower altitude," Kasara explained, standing at the helm. Even with her armor's helmet retracted, her stance reflected the disciplined soldier within. "I've identified a canyon range south of Idaron, rugged enough to obscure us from aerial scans. We'll land there, connect with the Arden Circle, and finalize our plan to infiltrate the research facility." Ronan nodded, leaning over her shoulder to examine the map. "And you trust these contacts? There's no chance they'll turn us over to Talix's forces?" Her jaw tightened. "No guarantee, but they have as much to lose as we do." Talix's regime threatens anyone who values freedom of thought. People who secretly cling to old stories, where our ancestors once cherished a balance of logic and feeling, are willing to risk everything. The ardent circle formed to protect that legacy. A soft chime signaled an incoming data feed. Kasara tapped a control, and the central display shifted to show the live vantage of Sidora itself, a sphere tinged blue and lavender by atmospheric refractions. Swirls of cloud cover partially obscured continents lined with glittering crystal. Ronan felt his heart constrict at the sight. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet overshadowed by the knowledge of what Talix intended to do. "Steady," Kasara murmured as she initiated descent. The ship angled downward, entering the planet's gravitational pull. Outside, cosmic darkness gave way to a pale amethyst glow. They hit the upper layers of the atmosphere, and turbulence rattled the hull. Alarms beeped briefly, necessary indicators, but no immediate danger. Kasara guided the vessel with deft adjustments, her hands moving fluidly over the console. For a moment, it reminded Ronan of the precarious trek they'd once made through collapsing tunnels, an impossible route, navigated with equal parts skill and luck. Within minutes, they were skimming the planet's surface, following a winding course through jagged canyon walls. From the cockpit's narrow external view, Ronan glimpsed towering shards of bluish crystal stabbing upward from the ground, some as tall as skyscrapers. Their edges refracted the light of Sidora's faint sun, sending glimmers dancing across the canyon floor. Eventually, the sensors located a level expanse nestled behind a ridge of crystal pillars, just large enough for them to set down without attracting undue attention. Kasara touched the thrusters gently, and with a final controlled descent, the ship settled onto the rocky ground. "We're here," she said, exhaling. Outside, the wind whistled, carrying a faint, eerie resonance as it threaded through crystal spires. She swiveled in her seat, meeting Ronan's eyes. "This is where it begins, and, if all goes as planned, where we give my people a future not dictated by fear." Ronan set a hand on her shoulder. "Let's make sure we give them that future, no matter what it takes." The ship's hatch opened with a hiss, releasing a gust of cool, mineral-scented air into the cabin. Ronan's boots struck the crystalline ground with a dull thud as he stepped outside. He surveyed the surrounding canyon, half amazed by the alien beauty of the rugged terrain. Towering structures of translucent crystal rose on every side, their edges razor-sharp and lit from within by refracted sunlight. The wind coaxed haunting hums from the pillars, a natural music that hinted at the power and mystery of Sidora's geological wonders. "We'll need to keep the ship powered down and masked," Kasara informed him as she emerged behind him, her armor now sealed except for the open visor at her face. "Prolonged idling might draw attention. The Arden Circle's rendezvous point is about a kilometer to the east, near a cave formation that leads to an underground conduit." Ronan nodded and shouldered the small pack containing rations and supplies. They had opted to travel light. Anything too cumbersome would slow them or risk detection. He glanced warily at the horizon where a faint shimmer suggested the curvature of the main city, Eidolon, far beyond the canyon's rim. "Any chance we'll run into patrols out here?" "Possibly," she admitted, glancing at the scanner on her forearm, "but local sensors show no immediate threats. The area is largely unpopulated, considered too remote for standard patrol routes. Sidorans have little interest in such rugged terrains. Only a few resource extraction teams come here, and not regularly." They set off along a pathway that wound between all crystal outcroppings. Underfoot, the ground felt firm, but occasionally shifted with sharp edges of fragmented crystal. Ronan took care with each step, recalling how easily a misstep could slice through boots. Kasara led the way, consulting her scanner every few minutes. Despite the seriousness of their mission, he couldn't help noticing the subtle changes in her body language. She moved with the same practiced grace he remembered, but there was an added alertness, an undercurrent of tension, as though she was painfully aware that this was home and yet no longer felt truly welcome. "Tell me about this contact in the Arden Circle," Ronan said, breaking the hush. "Someone you trust personally?" She paused briefly. "Yes, his name is Tirael. He was once my flight instructor before I fully enlisted. He witnessed my initial changes after returning from the mission where we met. I never confessed everything, but he suspected. Over time, he slipped me information about the dissenters and the efforts to preserve old cultural records about empathy. He risked much to keep me informed. Ronan nodded, boots crunching on crystalline gravel. And you're sure he's still on our side? Kasara's face hardened. As sure as I can be under the circumstances. If Talix discovered his involvement, he might have been coerced. Or worse. But the Ardent Circle is our best hope. I have to believe we still have allies. They continued, weaving through narrow passages. In one spot, the canyon walls converged, forcing them to squeeze between shimmering crystal columns. Ronan caught glimpses of his reflection on those glossy surfaces, his human face set against an alien world. It reminded him of the precarious intersection he represented, an outsider who somehow embodied what Talix feared and what Kasara believed her people needed. As they pressed onward, the ambient resonance in the canyon deepened, echoing through the labyrinth of crystal. Eventually, the path opened into a circular clearing, dominated by a jagged monolith that jutted skyward. Kasara checked her scanner, then motioned to a discreet opening at its base, a gap large enough to duck through. That's the entrance to the cave conduit, she explained, her voice hushed. The Ardent Circle set the rendezvous just inside. Together they approached, hearts pounding with the promise of either salvation or betrayal. The interior of the cave was an otherworldly cathedral, illuminated by clusters of phosphorescent crystals jutting from the walls. Their glow painted the cavern in violet and teal hues, casting shifting patterns across stone floors worn smooth by eons of subterranean currents. Ronan's breath caught at the sight. It reminded him of the half-buried tunnels on that fateful day. Only these formations were far more expansive, and he suspected, laden with decades of secrets. Kasara raised a hand in a silent signal to stay alert. They moved further in, boots echoing in the hollow space. Ahead, the passage curved, revealing a figure waiting by a large outcropping. He wore a dark tunic with subtle lines of Sidoran script embroidered along the shoulders, and his skin was a pale aquamarine shade, differing from Kessera's cerulean, but clearly of the same species. As they approached, he inclined his head, though his expression was guarded. "Kessera," he greeted in a clipped voice. "I wasn't entirely sure you would come, considering your abrupt disappearance. And you've brought—" His gaze flickered to Ronan, lingering with mingled curiosity and wariness. Ronan returned the stare, noting the tension in the man's posture. "Ronan Chambers," he offered. "I'm here to help." A flicker of surprise crossed the man's features. "A human," he murmured, as though testing the word. Then his attention returned to Kasara. "You took a risk bringing him. Does Talix know?" Kasara shook her head. "We bypassed standard patrol routes. If Talix suspects anything, she hasn't located us yet. Tyrell, we need your help. We have to shut down the perfect evolution protocol before it goes live." Tyrell folded his arms, tension palpable. "The Ardent Circle has grown bolder in your absence, Kasara. Talix's scientists are in the final stages of calibrating the suppression wave, and security around the main complex has never been tighter. Many of our sympathizers have already been rounded up or coerced into compliance. Every day, we lose more to forced reconditioning." Kasara winced at his words. "I feared as much, but we also have reason to hope. Ronan and I can offer evidence of the protocol's real impact. Complete loss of emotional capacity and irreversible psychic mutilation. If the people learn the truth, some will turn against Talix." Tyrell turned his gaze upon Ronan. "And you think a single human can sway them?" Ronan spread his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Not by myself, but I've seen firsthand what empathy can accomplish. If we expose Talix's plan, show the damage it will do, maybe we'll spark enough outrage to stop it." A dry laugh escaped Tyrell. "You speak as though anger itself is a resource we can simply conjure. We're taught from an early age to prize emotional control. Talix's propaganda machine frames any strong feeling as a sign of regression." Kasara stepped forward, her voice quiet but firm. "Tyrell, do you remember the old star songs you taught me? You once told me those tunes belonged to an era when we embraced emotion as part of life. Courage, devotion, sorrow, love. No matter what Talix says, that legacy isn't dead." He flinched, color washing faintly across his aquamarine cheeks. I do remember, and it's precisely why I chose to guide the Arden Circle. Come, he said at last, we'll take you to our refuge. Then we plan our next steps. Relief uncoiled in Ronan's chest. They had found an ally at least. The real test, confronting the heart of Talix's regime, still awaited. Tyrell guided them deeper into the subterranean network, descending through winding corridors where dripping mineral-laden water formed stalactites that glowed softly. They passed small alcoves carved into the walls, some containing supply caches or crude sleeping mats. Occasional hushed voices echoed from hidden pockets, reminding Ronan of an underground community forced into secrecy. At last, they reached a wider chamber that branched into multiple tunnels. About a dozen figures congregated there, men and women of varied hues from pale aqua to deep cobalt, each bearing that familiar chiseled grace shared by Sidorans. Their clothing was modest but accented with subtle patterns, as though reflecting personal identity once banned by strict uniform codes. At the sight of Kasara and Ronan, they froze in a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. One figure stepped forward, wearing the remnants of a formal uniform with insignia torn away. Terail, who are these newcomers? She demanded, her gaze raking over Ronan's human features. Ronan sensed a ripple of shock pass through the group. Many had likely never seen a human up close, except in propaganda broadcasts or sanitized holovids. Tyrell raised a hand for calm. Commander Jenna, this is Kasara, once a dedicated soldier to Talix, now an ally to our cause. And the human is called Ronan. He and Kasara bring us vital information. Murmurs spread through the gathering. Jenna regarded Kasara with narrowed eyes. I've heard rumors. You're the one who defied protocol to spare an outsider. The High Council marked you as a corrupted agent. Kasara straightened, her armor catching the chamber's bioluminescent glow. I am corrupted only in Talix's eyes because I learned the value of emotion. That is why I've returned, to stop her from robbing all of us of the ability to feel, to connect. She scanned the group, voice echoing with an urgency that transcended doubt. If Talix activates the perfect evolution protocol, we lose everything that makes us alive. We become hollow, soulless. Ronan stepped forward. He felt the weight of so many eyes on him, a living embodiment of Talix's worst fears. I know I'm an outsider, he began, tone steady but earnest. But what Kessera experienced in those caves years ago wasn't a fluke. It was proof that compassion is stronger than any dogma telling you to be numb. Your culture has a choice. You can keep what makes you unique, or let it be torn away by a leader who fears the power of genuine connection. A moment of silence held, thick with conflicting emotions. Then Jenna's stern features cracked slightly. Many of us have already felt the cracks in Talix's logic. We see what reconditioning does, how it erases entire personalities. I've lost friends to that process, but we're up against a fully armed regime with advanced surveillance. We're outnumbered. Kasara glanced at Ronan, then addressed Jaina. We have an advantage Talix underestimates. People are hungry for the truth. If we can show them evidence, recordings, testimonies, anything to prove the protocol's catastrophic effects, they might rise up in greater numbers. But we need a plan to infiltrate the main research facility. That's where Talix keeps her prototypes and data. Tyrell nodded in agreement. We've mapped out some vulnerabilities in the facility's lower sections, ventilation shafts, disused corridors. Accessing them will be dangerous but possible. Then we sabotage the central hub before Talix can complete the final broadcast. Gina's lips pressed into a thin line. All right, Kasara, if you truly believe we stand a chance, we'll coordinate a strike, but we'll need every scrap of courage we possess. Under the flickering light of glowing crystals, the Ardent Circle convened a makeshift war council. They gathered around a ragged table, hammered together from salvaged metal, smoothing out a cloth map of Iteron's research district. The layout revealed an intricately planned city, concentric rings of towering spires, with the innermost circle housing the high-security labs. Kasara pointed to a small marking near the perimeter. Here, she said, talented, an older maintenance tunnel connected to the crystal caverns beneath the labs. Talix's people likely never decommissioned it fully because these lower levels were believed unstable after seismic activity. Tyrell traced a path from the canyon to the city, frowning. We'll need to get past perimeter scanners, and that alone could trigger an alert if we're not careful. Gina folded her arms. Even if we enter through the maintenance tunnel, internal security includes patrols of drones equipped with motion and biosignature detectors. Humans register as anomalies, especially one traveling with the known corrupted warrior. She shot Kasara a meaningful look. Kasara nodded, her mouth set in a grim line. We do have some options, though. My armor can jam certain scanner frequencies, especially if the network is older or poorly maintained. She glanced at Ronan. We'll have to move carefully, short bursts of jamming, time between the drone's patrol cycles. But it's not perfect. Ronan, arms braced on the table, absorbed the details. So we slip in through the tunnels, avoid or dispel any drones we can't bypass, and find the core device. That's presumably in a central lab, right? Gina produced a small hollow projector, activating it to show a three-dimensional outline of the facility interior. Based on partial intel, the so-called evolution core is here, 2 sublevels down from the surface. It's a labyrinth of sealed chambers where Talix's top scientists are finalizing the neural suppression wave. We sabotage that, we buy ourselves time. Even if we can't fully destroy the technology, we can disrupt their timeline and expose the truth to the public. Tyrrell's gaze flicked around the group. The Arden Circle doesn't have the numbers to wage an open battle. We must count on inciting enough confusion to let us slip out with evidence. Then we broadcast that evidence to the city, hijacking communications if necessary. Kasara looked at Ronan. This is where you come in most critically. We have partial recordings, but a human explaining the emotional impact, showing how damaging it can be, might just shock our people. They see humans as brimming with uncontrollable feelings, something they've been taught to scorn. But if you speak to them directly, they might realize that these same feelings bring empathy and unity, not just chaos. Ronan exhaled, feeling the weight of a planet's fate resting on his shoulders. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. We do the infiltration, get the data, broadcast it, then what? If all goes well, said Gina, public outcry forces Talix to stand down, or at least buy us enough time to escalate a wider uprising. If it fails, she trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Failure likely meant reconditioning or death for them all. A hush fell over the chamber as they considered the plan's enormity. Finally, Tyrrell broke the silence. We strike tonight, under the cover of darkness. The city's outer sensors are less active in the late cycle. Kasara glanced around the circle of faces, wary but resolute. Then let's prepare. The future of Sidora might hinge on this operation. Let's make sure we're ready. Night fell swiftly on Sidora, though the deepening gloom of the canyon was offset by the planet's twin moons, which cast a pale glow over the rugged terrain. Ronan, Kasara, and 3 members of the Arden Circle, Tyrell, Gina, and a younger operative named Rajan, gathered near an unmarked transport vehicle. It was a small skimmer that hovered just above the ground, powered by crystals that emitted only a low hum. Its hull was painted in a matte finish designed to minimize sensor reflections. This will get us to the outskirts of Ideron before we transition to foot travel, Jenna explained. She crouched by the vehicle, double-checking the jamming device integrated into its undercarriage. We'll pulse the jammer in sync with the city's sensor sweeps. If we time it perfectly, they won't register our approach. Ronan adjusted a borrowed cloak over his shoulders, a drab garment that hid much of his human silhouette. His pulse throbbed in his neck, a constant reminder of how exposed they'd soon be. Let's hope your timing is impeccable. A flicker of wry humor lit Gina's eyes. We don't have much choice. She slid into the pilot's seat while Tyrell took the co-pilot station, readying the nav system. Kasara settled beside Ronan in the rear, her armor's visor partially lowered. As they powered up, a faint lurch indicated the skimmer rising on its anti-grav field. The crystals embedded in the craft glowed gently, reflecting a swirl of color against the canyon walls. With a low hum, they sped off through the darkness, heading toward the city that crouched like a watchful predator on the horizon. The journey took less than an hour. Along the way, they glided across plains dotted with otherworldly crystal spires. Ronan stared through the semi-opaque windscreen, glimpsing the faint silhouettes of mechanical sentry towers in the distance. tall, spindly structures that scanned the horizon with rotating beams of light. He braced himself each time the jamming device kicked in, causing the vehicle's readings to flicker. But each time their approach remained undetected, a testament to the Ardent Circle's meticulous planning. Soon they were cresting a ridge that overlooked Ideron. The city spread out in a ring of towering architecture, all angular lines and crystalline surfaces shimmering under moonlight. In the very center loomed a cluster of spires, the High Research District. To Ronan it resembled some futuristic fortress, each structure connected by sky bridges. Lights glowed in rhythmic patterns, hinting at a city that never truly slept, even if its populace strived to keep their emotions subdued. "Set down by that outcropping," Kasara advised, pointing to a natural formation that jutted from the ground, casting a deep shadow. "From there, we move on foot to the maintenance tunnel." Gina guided the skimmer to a gentle landing behind the outcropping. A hush followed as they all disembarked, checking gear and exchanging anxious glances. This was it, the infiltration attempt that could decide the planet's fate. Tyrell removed a small device from his belt, scanning the area to ensure no immediate patrols. Satisfied, he nodded for them to proceed. Kasara glanced at Ronan, her cerulean eyes filled with both determination and a flicker of concern. "Stay close," she whispered. "We stick to the plan, no matter what happens." He exhaled shakily, adjusting his cloak. "I'm with you." They slipped into the night, drawn toward the silent, gleaming city that held both a looming threat and the faint hope of liberation. The group entered Ideron's outskirts through narrow alleyways lined with smooth, crystalline walls. The city's design was meticulous, streets laid out in near-perfect grids, each block containing soaring structures with reflective surfaces. Occasionally, a floating orb of light would drift past, a drone scanning for unauthorized activity. At those moments, the Ardent Circle operatives stilled like statues, waiting for Kessera's armor to emit a brief jamming field. When the drone drifted away, they continued, hearts pounding. Eventually, they reached a recessed doorway set into the base of a massive building. A rusted sign in Sidoran script indicated it once served as a utility access for subterranean maintenance. Jaina produced a small hacking device, pressing it to the control panel. Beads of sweat glistened on her brow as she waited for the device to circumvent the lock. Time stretched tautly until the panel beeped and slid open, revealing a dim corridor that angled downward. One by one, they slipped inside. Soft emergency lights illuminated the hallway, casting elongated shadows. The scent of stale air and metal greeted them, a stark contrast to the crisp, open atmosphere above. Kasara took point, her visor overlay scanning for life forms or active security measures. "No immediate threats," she reported in a hushed voice, "but we should move quickly." They descended deeper, the corridor branching in unexpected ways. A few overhead lights flickered sporadically, as if starved for power. At an intersection, Tyrell consulted a handheld map. "Left," he whispered, pointing toward a corridor that ended in a heavy hatch. Beyond that hatch lay the lower levels, where Talix's scientists presumably worked around the clock on the final touches of the suppression wave. A loud clang reverberated behind them. Metal striking metal. All five froze, turning to see a lone security drone emerge from a side tunnel, its glowing sensor lens locked on them. An automated voice blared in the hush, announcing unauthorized personnel. Instantly, Gina fired a small EMP device, which fizzled in her hand, missing its mark. The drone's scanning beam intensified. Kasara reacted swiftly. Her armor pulsed with energy, unleashing a short-range jamming wave that distorted the drone's optics. The machine juddered, swiveling erratically. Ronan darted forward, slamming the butt of a makeshift staff into the drone's sensor array. Sparks flew, and it collapsed with a metallic crash. "Move," hissed Tyrell, beckoning them onward. They rushed to the hatch, hearts hammering in their chests. Rijan yanked it open, revealing a darkened stairwell spiraling down. Shouts and echoing alarms began to resonate from behind, unmistakable signs that security would converge on their location any second. "No time to hide," Kasara urged. "We make our stand at the core if we have to." With that, they plunged down the spiral, each footstep echoing in the enclosed shaft. Lights flickered as distant klaxons sounded. The entire facility seemed to awaken to their presence. pulses of color racing along the crystalline walls, as if the city itself were sounding an alarm. Ronan's mouth went dry, adrenaline burning in his veins. At the bottom of the stairwell, they came face to face with a massive metal door etched with advanced locking mechanisms, and beyond it, the labs that held the planet's future in their hands. Kasara's voice trembled with urgency. We sabotage that device, or Sidora loses its capacity to feel. There's no turning back now. They prepared to breach the door, hearts pounding, determined to make sure that Talix's perfect order would not extinguish the sparks of life and emotion that made each existence worth living. In the end, courage and empathy won out over fear and rigid control. By sabotaging the perfect evolution protocol and broadcasting the truth, Ronan and Kasara ignited a wave of emotional awakening throughout Sidora. People realized that their capacity to feel, whether it brought joy, sorrow, or love, was essential to what made them truly alive. The bonds of trust forged in secret tunnels and under starry skies paved the way for a better tomorrow, where logic and compassion could exist in harmony. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments and share your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspectives and continue the discussion.